Warning, the following video contains adult language, reference to sensitive topics, and questioning of the infallibility of scholarly sources. Viewer discretion is advised. Why hello there, and welcome back to Let's Make Us a Character. And in this very special episode, I'll be diving into the 980 pages of fetid people, meat, and fluids that is 2004's From Another Time, Another Land, more commonly known as Fatal. A game that has something of a reputation as the worst tabletop role-playing game, a reputation that I honestly think is not technically accurate. There are worse designed games, half-assed efforts with broken, incomplete, or just incomprehensible rules. And there are more offensive games, ones designed with the intention of spreading hateful propaganda, or with the specific goal of being offensive enough to be banned from platforms, so that the designer can cry about getting cancelled. There are even more overly complicated games, ones where even the simplest action requires rolling on 3 different tables. No, Fatal is not the worst in any one category. Instead, its notoriety comes from its unique combination of obscenely complicated rules and edgily offensive content, all wrapped in a layer of pseudo-intellectual bullshit that constantly tries to justify those two things, as well as the complete lack of self-awareness and unprofessional conduct of its creators. This is almost 1,000 pages of some of the worst game design and shittiest takes ever put to page, whose creators somehow thought it was going to be a commercially successful product. Like they seriously recommended and expected that groups would be buying numerous copies of this book, which once again is 980 pages long. In their minds, books were already shipping out bundled with a free CD-ROM. They were just so weirdly confident that this was a thing that would have appeal beyond their isolated peer group, despite overwhelming evidence that it would not. Because Fatal, From Another Time, Another Land, is what is generally considered the second edition of the game after Fatal, Fantasy Adventure to Adult Lechery, although it is really more like a beta and complete version. And just for my own convenience, I will be calling them Adult Lechery and Another Land from this point on. Now, the earliest archived version of the Fatal Games website dates to December 2001. Unfortunately, the version of the game available back then may very well be lost to time, but the widely available version of Adult Lechery has a notice stating that Fatal was conceived on October 25th, 2000, so we can assume the alpha release was at some point between those two dates. So they had years to judge interest in and reaction to this game, and the interest was only in mocking it, and the reaction was universally negative. And while some of the more egregious content was removed, possibly due to the negative reaction, the decision to continue moving forward with this project and releasing Another Land is a very perplexing one. Like, seriously, there was actual work put into bringing Another Land up to the level of a professional product, and I would say that the version available is like 90% of the way there. Although they might not have understood exactly how formatting for print books actually works. But then when this version was met with the same level of vicious yet well-deserved mockery as the first, they fought for a while, but then just kinda left their magnum opus to rot in an almost finished state as a monument to their ineptitude. And before we actually get into this, I do feel that it is important that we try to understand a little bit where the author of Fatal was coming from, because it actually makes some things a little easier to understand. And the most important thing to understand when it comes to Fatal is that the author considered this to be a scholarly game, and this is where aforementioned pseudo-intellectual bullshit starts to come into play. This is a game that claims to strive for realism and historical/mythological accuracy. That is the main objective here, to which everything else, like playability or fun, is secondary. There's even a whole manifesto about it on the website, some highlights of which include acknowledging that there were non-white people and cultural influences in medieval Europe, but also that they have been removed from the game, which is not racist because it was done in the name of traditional fantasy tenets, which is, hilarious because historical accuracy, one of the stated most important aspects of this game, goes right out the window as soon as it doesn't support what they want it to. And that is a theme that will continue, and I will continue to comment on it. And then there's also a notice that any objections to the historical accuracy of Fatal, which are supported by scholarly literature, may be submitted via email. Which I'm sure they got more than a few of because the historical accuracy here is flimsy at best and intentionally misleading at worst. And that is another thing, the obsession with scholarly sources. This book is just littered with an almost comical number of footnotes pointing to a handful of references, because I assume the author thinks that references mean immunity to criticism. I mean, it can't be racist or sexist if you're referencing scholarly sources, right? It's like they genuinely do not understand that scholarly does not mean true or even widely accepted, but at some point they developed the belief that references equal proof because in the game of academia, that's how it works. Sometimes they even just say they have scholarly sources and don't even reference any specifically. It very much has the feeling of someone wearing a pair of fake glasses to make themselves look smarter. And with all of that out of the way, I suppose I can't put this off any longer. Although just because I do not hate myself that much, I will be reusing the character that I made in my Fatal character creation livestream. My 5-hour Fatal character creation livestream, in which I didn't actually even finish the character. This time I will be finishing the character, hopefully in less than 5 hours. Not in this video though, this is just part 1 of at least 3, probably more, where we will be generating a character's ability scores, race, and gender. You know, the things that are usually already done by this point in the video. So let's make us a Fatal character. Part 1. Totally not racist or misogynistic. Now, just to make this as coherent of an experience as possible, I am going to be doing things a little out of book order, so we will be starting with Chapter 3, Abilities, which is what they call attributes here. And we have 5 abilities: Physique, Charisma, Dexterity, Intelligence, and Wisdom. Okay, y'all knew it wasn't going to be that easy. Each ability also has 4 sub-abilities. In Physique, we have Physical Fitness, Strength, Bodily Attractiveness, and Health. In Charisma, Facial, Vocal, Kinetic, and Rhetorical. In Dexterity, Hand-Eye Coordination, Agility, Reaction Speed, and Enunciation. In Intelligence, Language, Math, Analytic, and Spatial. And in Wisdom, Drive, Intuition, Common Sense, and Reflection. So, probably the only RPG that has dedicated enunciation and spatial intelligence attributes. And then we roll a D100 for each of the sub-abilities. Nah, I'm just kidding. You roll 10 D100, then divide the result by 5 and subtract 1, rounding down, giving us a heavily center-weighted range of 1 to 199. Then we average the values of the 4 sub-abilities to get each core ability's value. And if you are playing along at home, that is 200 rolls we've made so far just to generate our base attributes. And at this point, I should probably mention that the designer of Fatal was purportedly a statistician, and somehow decided that probability curves equal realism. And as you will recall, creating a world where reality fits the author's views is a big part of this game's mission statement. There is also an optional rule to let you re-roll up to 4 of your sub-abilities, with the highest 4 of 5d100 divided by 2 minus 1, which does skew the average a bit higher, but we will definitely not be doing that because each re-roll requires that you take a random mental illness, many of which will make your character more or less unplayable by forcing them to make checks to avoid things like dying from anorexia, cutting off their own limbs, exposing themselves to strangers, let's just say making friends with any corpse they encounter, and of course, multiple where you have to make checks to avoid forcing yourself on anyone you find attractive. Welcome to Fatal. And there's a bit more to deal with here, but we need to apply some modifiers before the next step, and we won't be done with the modifiers until the next video. So now back to Chapter 1, Race and Gender, a chapter where I'm sure that nothing will be even slightly offensive. There are 16 player races available, which have been selected from European mythology and folklore, with the strict criteria of also being bipedal, mortal, smaller than giants, and having no special abilities. And as you will see, maybe they should have had some stricter criteria. The available options are Anakim, Bugbear, Black Dwarf, Brown Dwarf, White Dwarf, Dark Elf, Light Elf, Human, Kobold, Ogre, Cliff Ogre, Gruaga Ogre, Kinderfresser Ogre, Borbitingarna Troll, Hill Troll, and Subterranean Troll. And if you know a little German, you might be thinking, hold on, did you just say Kinderfresser, as in child eater? And yeah, I did. That is just the kind of game we're dealing with. Several of the races here are just kind of unplayable for a variety of reasons. For example, all of the ogres are anthropophagus. That means they eat people, with the Kinderfresser ogres specifically eating human children, and also having a voice that supernaturally lures, quote, prepubescent virginal children to them. And I would like to remind you that I am not pulling random races out of some monster section. Everything I'm talking about here are presented as player races. Trolls also eat people, but unlike ogres who primarily eat humans, they will eat any sentient species, except trolls of the opposite gender, because in addition to the anthropophagy, this book has a really weird obsession with sex, but not in the fun way, more in the way where it is specifically stated that hill trolls are sexually aroused by eating people's brains. And I can't even go over a lot of the stuff here, but just in general, everything goes about 2 steps further than you would expect. But the least playable race is probably the subterranean trolls, who, in addition to eating babies, have males that are unsightly and malicious, and females that are beautiful but exceedingly vile. Because I guess we're just trying to hit every single overdone fantasy trope here. And must make a check to resist attacking any human or elven woman with a higher bodily attractiveness or facial charisma score. But none of that is what makes them the least playable. No, that would be the fact that sunlight turns them to stone. An effect that I can only assume is instantaneous and unavoidable, as they didn't feel the need to provide rules for it, because this game has literally no sense of priority on anything. And mind you, these are just the big, obvious things that make most of the races unplayable due to being unable to actually interact with the game world in any kind of normal way. There are other, more specific ways that a character's race can make them unplayable, in addition to many other elements, which will be discussed in Part 3, probably. And since everything in this game is based on historical/mythological accuracy supported by scholarly sources, it is probably also worth noting that there are no sources provided for the mythological accuracy of any of this. The only reference in this entire section is just about the existence of the concept of Anakim, who incidentally are the author's super cool original species, but because of who the author is, they also need to have some kind of stupid, obscure mythological origin. Ironically, a Christian origin, another culture that has been intentionally removed from the game world. Anyway, back to actual character creation. We roll for our race on the race table, and let's just keep in mind that anything above a 73 is a race that is largely defined by eating people. And if we add bugbears to that, who are also specifically stated to enjoy eating human children, an overall 42% chance that your character will think babies are very tasty. And this is a weird situation where the author, almost understands that there's a problem, because it states that the E-dial, yeah, that's what they call the GM here, not pretentious at all, may allow you to choose your race because a group of players of different races might not get along. Gee, I wonder why. However, they do also make sure to point out that rolling is preferable because it's more realistic, and no one gets to choose their race in reality. And remember, realism and historical/mythological accuracy are the big points of this game. And I feel like this is a perfect example of the weird mentality of this game. A big part of the let's just be generous and call it a design philosophy seems to be the idea that the game's author has no control over the content. They state that different races might not get along. Yeah, because you made them that way. The choice of content included has absolutely no concern for practicality, which, believe me, is actually going to get worse from here. And that fact is treated like it's not their fault. It's like they actually do not understand that randomly rolling your race is only a problem because they made it so that there's more than a 50% chance that the result will be someone who cannot interact with human society. That's on you. It's not historical and/or mythological accuracy. You were not helpless to stop child-eating ogres or brain-fucking trolls from being possible results on the table. You put them there. Honestly, if anything, the more realistic and historically/mythologically accurate option would be to restrict available races to those who can actually be played in the game. But that would require looking at the game's design from a perspective that they were either unwilling to consider or unable to comprehend, and this will be a major topic when I discuss the occupations in a later video, so I will hold my thoughts on that topic for now. Anyway, in the name of realism and historical/mythological accuracy, we will roll, and 59, which is Kobold. But of course not the fun little dragon or lizard dog kinds, just small silver-skinned humanoids whose only defining characteristic is how much they love slavery. They're the ones on the cover fighting the designer's super cool OC. So I guess, relatively speaking, they are not as bad as some of the other options. I mean, they are not specifically noted as having a reputation for eating and/or raping people, which I must remind you, most of the other races are. Anyway, as a kobold, we get -40 to strength, -15 to bodily attractiveness, -15 to facial and vocal charisma, +15 to kinetic charisma, -10 to rhetorical charisma, +15 to hand-eye coordination, agility, reaction speed, and enunciation, -10 to language and analytic intelligence, +15 to spatial intelligence, and -15 to drive. As well as a bunch of other stuff that I will get to when it becomes relevant. But for now, we still need to determine how racist our character is. Yeah, that's a real fucking thing in this game. So we pull up the racial hatred table, a real thing in this book, which gives a general view of members of each race towards others, ranging from 1, which is a preference, to 5, which is hatred. And if we look up kobolds, we see that 12 of the results are 5, 3 are 4, and kobolds are 1, which is actually kind of average, something that becomes really obvious when I color code the table. Remember, red is not begrudging acceptance with slight prejudice. It is not outward dislike. It is hatred. And let's just isolate the human row for a minute and see that humans are accepting of brown dwarves and light elves, indifferent towards white dwarves, dislike Anakim, and hate everyone else. And since the surface world is predominantly humans, that does more or less mean that humans, light elves, and brown and white dwarves are the only actual playable races, the only ones who can actually interact with human society. And remember, this game has a massive hard-on for realism and historical accuracy, as well as the belief that everything in this book meets those definitions. So if it says hatred, it means hatred, not a mild prejudice that can be overcome with mutual understanding. Anyway, then we need to roll 3d10 for each of the 16 races on the individual racial hatred table to determine our character's specific racial hatreds. And it seems that we have a preference for kobolds, dislike of bugbears, gruaga ogres, and hill trolls, and hatred for everyone else. Which I guess means they were right about not rolling because this character pretty much cannot work with any other race. Once again, a thing that they were just helpless to avoid. This big racism section just existed itself into the book and nothing could be done about it. And before we move on, I would just like to point out the section on racial slurs, which is another interesting look into the mind of the creator, because obviously they want to have a section on racial slurs. That is some edgy historical realism, but the actual slurs included are really lame, because I guess there's no historical reference available for racial slurs for elves, dwarves, and whatnot, and without some scholarly resource to work off, I guess the extent of the author's creativity is things like twig, fatties, and poople. Probably why one of the ones for kobolds is just an actual slur, something that I'm sure the author has an impressive collection of. But as is usual, the most hilarious is reserved for the author's favorite, the Anakim. Human men call females hourglasses. Human men call males raptors. Human women call females demon whores. Human women call males skinloaf or stovepiper due to their manhood. Dude wants to fuck these things so bad. Like, if you are tasked to come up with racial slurs for your super cool original species, and all of them are based around how much people want to fuck them, your talents are probably best left on DeviantArt. Anyway, that's it for race, so now on to gender, which brings up another weird quirk of this game, that being an understanding of topics which are considered progressive by today's standards, like sex and gender being different things, but then immediately getting weird again by specifically choosing to refer to sex as gender out of a stated concern that people would confuse sex with sex acts. And once again, the E-dial will determine if we are to roll or choose, and of course rolling is more realistic, but is somewhat discouraged here, as characters with random gender may be inappropriate. Gee, wonder what they mean by that. Instead, it is suggested that you choose based off the following information or personal preference. That following information being some quotes from Aristotle's The History of Animals, and an explanation about how women are seen as universally inferior and treated as property in patriarchal cultures, such as the one in this game. And then also stresses the importance of not violating those cultural norms, just in case you had gotten the crazy idea that you could still play a female character who challenged those norms. So once again, back to the obsession with historical accuracy over, having a playable game. But that very specific kind of historical accuracy where you track down one source that almost says what you want it to, and then base your entire understanding of history around that. Anyway, we are going to go against the author's wishes and roll, because here at Let's Make Us a Character, we believe in realism and historical/mythological accuracy. And they do not actually provide a gender table here. Instead, we need to use the one for determining the sex of offspring in a later chapter, because, as you may know, this is the game with weird rules for pregnancy. So let's roll, and oh no, 1 female. Well, at least that's going to make the next video even more weird and awkward. And as a femoid, we take -5% to physical fitness, -30% to strength, +3% to bodily attractiveness and facial charisma, +2% to languages, -3% to math and spatial intelligence, -2% to drive, +5% to intuition, and +4% to reflection, as well as +2 to our sanguine and -2 to our choleric temperaments, because of course this game numerically defines the classical humors. And also important to keep in mind here is that these modifiers are opposite for male and female characters. So a female character with a -30% adjustment to strength does not have 70% the strength of a male character. They have 70% of the base strength, and males have 130%. So it's more like female characters have 54% the strength of male characters on average. And you might be thinking that this whole thing is kind of sexist, but I can assure you that all of these modifiers are based on scholarly literature. What scholarly literature specifically, it doesn't say, but I'm sure that it is very valid sources. And if you just read through every single source listed in the references section, at least one of them will probably be able to be read in a way that vaguely supports some of this. And also, it is important to note here that, if anything, the gender modifiers are actually more biased against males. Yeah, dude actually put that in the book and thought it was some kind of slam dunk. However, now there is something of a question about how to proceed. The book says, do not apply the gender modifiers until after the sub-abilities have been generated. Because as you may have noticed, the racial modifiers were just plus or minus, but the gender modifiers are percentile adjustments. So the order does matter. And it's only a few points here, but if this character were, say, an ogre with a strength modifier of plus 240, the difference becomes significant. And remember, we went out of order here. In the book, the content is presented in the order of race, gender, body, which provides some additional modifiers, and then abilities. So technically, we should have all of those modifiers before we even roll our sub-abilities. Now, the logical answer would be to apply the racial modifiers first. That way the gender modifiers would apply the same percentile-based variances consistently across all races, and then finally the body modifiers to reflect variances based on the individual's physiology. So let's just do that, as the alternative is combing through the entire book looking for some clue as to the correct order in which to proceed. So, racial modifiers? Applied. Gender modifiers? Applied. And this character? is not even close to done. But that is it for this video. Definitely the least productive episode of Let's Make Us a Character to date, but still an interesting experience that gave us a lot to think about. I think we can all agree that the role of race and gender in role-playing games is a very nuanced topic, but Fatal kinda makes it not. Putting aside the whole whites only part, which remember is an actual thing in this game, it presents a world that is very fantasy racially segregated. Almost none of the 16 player races can coexist. But more importantly, they created a world where that segregation, fear, and hatred is justified, and then constantly tell you how realistic and historically accurate it is. Humans don't hate bugbears because they're misunderstood. Humans hate bugbears because bugbears raid their communities, raping the women and eating the children, then taking any survivors as slaves. They make it very clear that almost every other race is a major threat to humans. And if you do not see how the perspective being presented here translates from fantasy racism to real-world racism, you are either lying or have the same complete lack of self-awareness as the author of Fatal. And before you finish typing out your comment about it being impossible for something to be racist unless it directly references real-world ethnicities in text, let's just look at some of that content that was removed from adult lechery. Like the armors that turn characters into Asian, Jewish, and Black stereotypes. So let's keep in mind here that everything in this book is coming from the same mind that thought these were hilarious and/or highbrow scholarly content. And yes, when somebody is racist, it is perfectly reasonable to assume that that has influenced anything that they create. And similarly, the topic of sex-based modifiers and/or discrimination in game worlds is something where there is a lot of discussion to be had, except for here where they make everything so extremely hostile towards women that there is really no counter-argument. Like, even if it were historically accurate, which obviously it must be, I mean, they have a single source, that doesn't really justify creating or playing in a world where the average city has more rape gangs than Turkana 4. And once again, it's this absurd idea that they are somehow being held to some objective historical reality whenever they think that justifies what they want to put in, but then are more than willing to violate that historical accuracy when it doesn't. Fatal takes all of the issues with other role-playing games and magnifies them to such an absurd level that you really can't defend them without tipping your hand about your underlying motivations. If anything, the only value Fatal can add to the conversation is as an example of what definitely crosses the line. Although I do know from experience with the comment section that there is no real limit on how stupid people are willing to make themselves look in order to make a bad faith argument. And that is it for this video. Make sure to join me next time when we'll be getting into the character's body and mind, which, yes, does mean we will be rolling for assorted depths and circumferences. So that's something to look forward to. And thank you for watching, with extra special thanks to my Fightin' Flail Snails, Randy Mulholland, and Toshirokuro. If you'd like to be cool like them, check out my Patreon, where you can get early access to videos and fun stuff that I make for the Patreon. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos floating around screen that either myself or the cold, heartless YouTube algorithm have lovingly selected for you, which I'm sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.